The night Colton Birch checked into the Hargrove Inn, he had already decided it would be his last. Not in the way most people decide things. Not with urgency or drama. Just a quiet, settled knowing that had moved into his chest sometime in the weeks before and never left. He had driven 3 hours from the city, not because this town meant anything to him, but because it meant nothing. No one here would recognize his face from the business section of a newspaper. No one would ask how Vira Medical was recovering or whether he'd comment on the lawsuit or whether he felt any remorse. He had chosen invisibility the way a man chooses a coat when the cold becomes too much to ignore. The inn was the kind of place that apologized for itself quietly. A faded awning, a potted plant that had given up sometime around August. The sign in the window read vacancy in orange neon, one letter blinking unevenly, as if even the building was uncertain about its own welcome. Colton pushed through the glass door just after 10, rain darkening the shoulders of his jacket, his overnight bag hanging from one hand. There was a woman behind the front desk. She was young, mid-20s, maybe with dark hair pulled back unevenly, like she'd done it in a hurry and never looked in a mirror after. She was frowning at a laminated binder, lips moving slightly, clearly in the middle of trying to understand something that refused to be understood. A sticky note on the edge of the monitor read, "Press F8 before anything Ilse and someone else's handwriting." She looked up when the door opened, and the frown disappeared, replaced by the practiced brightness of someone doing their best. "Hi there, welcome." A pause. "Sorry, I'm covering for my cousin tonight. The system is a little, She gestured vaguely at the computer. "Challenging." Colton set his bag on the floor. "I have a reservation." "Great, okay." She pressed F8. "Name?" "Birch," he said. "Colton Birch." She typed it in carefully, one key at a time, and he watched her scan the screen with the focused expression of someone diffusing something. "Got it. One night. King room." She looked up. "Checking out tomorrow?" He didn't answer right away. "Sir?" "Yes," he said, "tomorrow." She handed him the key card, an actual plastic card, the kind hotels had mostly retired a decade ago, and their fingers came close but didn't quite touch. She was already back to squinting at the binder before he reached the elevator. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors closed. He looked at his own reflection in the scratched metal panel and then looked away. Room 312 smelled like cedar and old carpet. The window faced the street where rain was collecting in the gutter and running in a thin silver line toward the drain. Colton set his bag on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the bed without taking off his coat. He sat there for a long time. There was a letter in his bag. He had written it 3 days ago, revised it twice, then stopped revising because revision implied someone was going to read it carefully, and he no longer believed that. His board of directors had stopped reading his communications carefully approximately 6 months ago, around the time the headline ran, "Viron Medical Implant Linked to Surgical Death, CEO Under Fire." After that, everyone read his words the way people read crime scene reports, looking for confirmation of what they already believed. The patient's name had been Roy Callahan, 51 years old, a retired school teacher from Baton Rouge who had needed a post-cardiac surgical monitor implanted as routine follow-up care. The device had malfunctioned during the first calibration cycle. He had died on the table before the surgical team understood what they were dealing with. Colton had been in a board meeting when the call came through. He remembered exactly what he had been arguing about, the color scheme on the new investor deck. That memory lived inside his ribs now like something that had calcified there. He stood up and walked to the window. The street below was empty. A single streetlight reflected off the wet pavement in an unsteady oval. He pressed his palm flat against the glass and felt the cold move through it. He had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in 4 months. His apartment had 3,200 square feet, and he moved through it like a man navigating someone else's furniture. His assistant Jared had been sending him daily briefings he hadn't opened. His sister Claire had stopped calling after he let it go to voicemail 17 times, and he didn't blame her. The guilt was not loud. That was the thing people didn't understand about it. It wasn't the screaming kind. It was the quiet kind, the kind that sat at the table with you every morning and reminded you, in a voice like a low hum, that you had built something that killed a man who had spent his life teaching 8th graders how to read maps. He had tried to explain this to the therapist his attorney insisted on. She had nodded and asked about his childhood. He had not gone back. He opened the window an inch. Cold air moved in. He breathed it. Downstairs, he imagined, the woman at the front desk was still battling the laminated binder. He had noticed, when she handed him the key, that there was ink on her left index finger, blue, the kind that came from a leaking pen, and that her earrings didn't match, one small gold hoop and one tiny silver star, as if she had gotten dressed thinking about everything except herself. He closed the window. He sat back down on the edge of the bed and thought about Roy Callahan's brother, whose name was Dennis. Dennis Callahan had waited outside the courthouse on the third day of preliminary hearings, not with a sign or a photographer, just himself, in a gray windbreaker, standing near the concrete planter that held a dying fern. He had looked at Colton as he passed and said quietly, without rage, "I hope you live long enough to carry this the right way." Not a curse. Not a wish for suffering. Just a sentence that landed somewhere behind Colton's sternum and never left. He lay back on the bed, still in his coat, and stared at the ceiling. He was not afraid. That was the other thing. He had expected fear in those weeks of walking toward this decision, and it had never arrived. What arrived instead was a profound, exhausting stillness, like a room after all the furniture has been moved out. He closed his eyes. At some point, he didn't know how long, he heard the rain intensify against the window. He got up, not out of any particular intention, and walked to the window again. He stood there for a while. Then, without fully deciding to, he opened the door and walked down the hall to the small exterior landing at the end of the corridor, a narrow outdoor platform with a rusted railing and two plastic chairs no one had moved in what looked like years. He sat in one of them. The rain was cold and immediate. He didn't move. He was not thinking. That was almost a relief. He was just sitting and the rain was falling, and for a few minutes he was not Colton Birch, CEO of a company under federal review. He was just a man getting wet. He sat there for a long time. When he finally came back inside, his coat was soaked through. He toweled off his face in the bathroom and sat at the small desk by the window. He opened his bag, moved past the letter, and took out nothing. He just sat with his hands on the desk. In the morning, before first light, he was going to check out. He had thought about this carefully and chosen a place about 40 minutes north, a reservoir overlook accessible by a hiking trail that wouldn't be busy on a Tuesday morning in November. He had looked at it on a map. He had even looked at the weather forecast. He realized, planned this more carefully than he had planned anything in the last 6 months. He turned off the lamp and lay down on top of the covers. He was almost asleep when something moved across the floor. He heard it before he saw it. A soft whisper of paper, and then a pale rectangle of folded white appeared beneath the door, sliding in with a hesitation that made it seem almost reluctant. It stopped just inside. Nobody knocked. He looked at it for a long moment from across the room. He got up. He picked it up, unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, slightly rushed, done in blue ink with the kind of pen that ran a little thick on downstrokes. 7 words. Whatever you're carrying tonight, you matter. No name, no explanation, no room number. He read it again. He sat down on the edge of the bed with the paper in his hand. He read it a third time. It was not poetry. It was not particularly eloquent. It was the kind of thing that, if he read it under other circumstances, he might have set aside without much feeling. But under these circumstances, in this room, in this particular hour, it cracked something open. He did not cry right away. He sat very still, and then, quietly in the dark of a 3-star inn in a town he had chosen for its anonymity, Colton Birch put his face in his hands and wept. Not from pain, not from grief, exactly. From the simple, devastating surprise of being seen by someone who had no reason to look. He didn't sleep, but he didn't leave either. At 6 in the morning, he called room service. The inn had a limited one, a laminated card on the nightstand, and ordered coffee and toast. When it arrived, he ate sitting at the desk with the folded note beside his cup. He checked out at 8. The woman from last night was not at the desk. An older man with reading glasses and a Steelers mug checked him out without looking up. Colton returned his key card and walked out into a gray morning that smelled like wet oak leaves. He sat in his car for 11 minutes before starting it. Then he drove north, past the reservoir overlook without stopping, and kept going until he reached a rest stop with a vending machine and a payphone nobody used anymore. He sat on a bench and called Claire, who answered on the second ring in a voice full of a fear she had been managing for months. "Colt," she said. "I'm okay," he said. I'm not, but I'm here." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Stay on the phone." He did. The months that followed were not a recovery in the way movies show recovery. There was no montage. There was no pivotal morning when he woke up feeling like himself again. There was just the slow, grinding work of choosing to remain, day after day, even when remaining felt like the harder option. He hired an independent investigator, then a second one. He spent 3 months buried in technical reports, subcontractor audits, and calibration logs that he read until his eyes burned. What emerged, slowly and with brutal clarity, was something he had suspected but been afraid to fully believe. The failure had not originated in Virion's design. It had come from a third-party firmware component, supplied through a chain of subcontractors so obscure that it had taken a forensic audit to trace. The flaw had been invisible under standard testing protocols. It had only surfaced under a specific sequence of conditions present during Roy Callahan's surgery. This did not make Roy Callahan less dead. Colton was careful never to use the finding as absolution. But it changed the shape of what he was carrying. He took the full report to Dennis Callahan himself. He drove to Baton Rouge and sat in the kitchen of a house that had a vegetable garden out back, and a photo of Roy on the refrigerator held up by a magnet from a national park neither of them had visited. He put the report on the table and explained it, page by page, without a lawyer present. Dennis Callahan listened. He asked 3 questions. He did not forgive Colton, and Colton did not ask him to. But at the end, when Colton stood to leave, Dennis had said, "He would have appreciated that you came yourself." That sentence lived differently inside Colton's chest than the one before it. He restructured Virion's supplier review process from scratch. He brought in an independent ethics board. He funded a fellowship in Roy Callahan's name through the hospital where it had happened. He did not announce any of this in a press release. Slowly, carefully, the company began to recover. Not to what it had been. To something different, more careful, more accountable, staffed in part now by people who had been drawn in by the change rather than repelled by the collapse. He came back different. He knew this because Jared, his assistant, had said it directly, which Jared almost never did. "You're quieter than you used to be. I mean that as a compliment." Colton had thought about the note almost every day. It lived in his wallet, folded into a square the size of a business card, soft at the corners from handling. He had tried twice to find out who had left it. The inn's records from that night were incomplete. The system his front desk coverage had been battling had apparently crashed entirely by midnight and been restored from a backup that lost 2 hours of data. The regular receptionist remembered only that someone had filled in for her, but couldn't recall who. He had let it go. Or tried to. What he couldn't let go of was this: someone had noticed. Someone had looked at a stranger through a rain-streaked window. He assumed it had been from the front desk, given the angle of the landing, and had decided that stranger was worth a piece of paper and 7 words. No name. No expectation of reply. Just the act itself complete. He thought about that often, especially in meetings where people performed concern very loudly, or in profile pieces where journalists described him in the careful language of a man being rehabilitated. None of that ever felt like being seen. The note had. He began asking questions in the direction of the inn again, this time through an intermediary, a private research firm he used for HR background checks. It took 6 weeks. The answer, when it came, was small and specific. The substitute front desk worker on the night of November 9th had been a woman named Waverly Dunn, 24 years old at the time, a part-time nursing student at Adler Community College who had covered shifts for her cousin Petra Reyes during exams and emergencies. Her last known address was in the same town where the inn was located, though she had since moved. No current employer on file. Colton held that name for 2 weeks before doing anything with it. He did not want to appear in her life like a consequence. He did not want her to feel that a good act had created an obligation or that she was now tangled in something she hadn't signed up for. He thought about Dennis Callahan's kitchen, about sitting across from grief without an agenda, and he tried to apply the same discipline here. He asked the research firm for a professional profile only, not her address, not her phone number. What came back surprised him. Waverly Dunn had, in the 2 years since that night, completed her nursing degree. She had also, simultaneously, built something unexpected, a small community health program operating out of 2 borrowed rooms in a church basement on the east side of the county, offering basic health screenings, medication literacy workshops, and a mobile appointment scheduling service for families without insurance navigating the county hospital system. She had started it with a folding table, a donated laptop, and, as far as the firm could tell, no funding whatsoever. She had since received a small county grant and a write-up in a regional nonprofit newsletter. She had 17 volunteers. She was, the newsletter noted, working toward accreditation. Colton read the profile on a Tuesday morning in his office, coffee going cold on the desk beside him. He did not need to think very long about what to do. He had his team vet the program's structure and financials, which took 4 days and came back clean. Then he called a meeting with Varion's new director of community partnerships, a position he had created 8 months ago as part of the restructure, and laid out a proposal that did not originate with her and hadn't gone through committee. 3 days later, Waverly Dunn received a formal letter from the Viron Medical Foundation inviting her to apply for a capacity-building grant and a partnership consultation. The letter was signed by the foundation's director, not by Colton. It mentioned that the program had been identified through a community health initiative scan, which was technically true in the way that technically true things sometimes are. She called the foundation number. The director, who had been fully briefed, handled the call. Waverly Dunn said she had never applied. She said she assumed there had been a mistake. The director said there hadn't. She agreed to a site visit. Colton was not present for the site visit. He received the associate's report afterward. The program was well organized, substantially under-resourced, and run with a rigor that the associate described, in the professional language of her field, as impressively disciplined for a 2-person team. There was a handmade sign on the door that read, "You belong here," in block letters. The associate had photographed it. The grant was approved within 2 weeks. Colton requested to deliver it in person. The foundation director raised an eyebrow and said that was unusual. He said he was aware. He drove the 3 hours himself, without Jared, in the same car he had driven on a different night to a different destination 2 years before. The roads were familiar in an uncomfortable way. He passed the exit for the Hargrove Inn without slowing. The church was a small white building set back from a residential street with old oak trees planted too close to the sidewalk, their roots lifting the concrete in long, slow waves. He parked and sat for a moment. Then he got out. The door to the program's rooms was propped open. He could hear a voice inside, calm, clear, explaining something about prescription labels and what to ask a pharmacist. He stood in the hallway and waited. When she came to the door, she was wearing blue scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck and a pen tucked above her ear, and she had the focused expression of someone in the middle of 4 things. She looked at him the way you look at a person you recognize but can't immediately place, the way people look when a face and a context are separated by time and circumstance. Then she placed it. The color shifted in her face, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, surprise, recalibrating. "Mr. Birch," she said. "Waverly," he said. "I'm sorry to come without more warning. I wanted to bring this myself." He held out the grant envelope. It was a real one, sealed, the foundation's logo in the corner. "And to say thank you." She didn't take it right away. She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the feeling she was doing the same thing he had been doing for 2 years, trying to make the accounting work, trying to understand how a small act had propagated so far in either direction. "You knew," she said. "The letter was from you." "It came from the foundation, but yes, I asked them to look for you." He paused. "I kept the note." Something passed through her expression that he couldn't fully name. She looked away briefly, at the propped open door, at the hallway behind him, and then back. "I didn't know if it was okay to write it," she said. I almost didn't." "I know," he said. "I'm glad you did." She took the envelope. There was a long moment, the kind that doesn't require filling, where the oak trees outside let a gust of wind move through them and the sound reached through the open door like a slow exhale. "Do you want to see what we're doing here?" she asked finally. "Very much," he said. She showed him the rooms, the folding tables still, though better ones now, and a proper desktop on a second-hand desk, and a filing system organized in labeled binders that reminded him, faintly, of the one she had been puzzling over the night they first met. There were health literacy posters on the walls, printed cheaply but placed with care, a whiteboard covered in scheduling blocks, a corner with 2 chairs and a box of children's books, for the patients who came with kids in tow. She introduced him to her co-coordinator, a retired LPN named Judith, who shook his hand with the grip of someone who had assessed people for a living and had not yet decided about him. He found that he preferred this to the deference he usually received in rooms. They walked and talked for over an hour. She asked questions about the Foundation's reporting requirements that were specific and practical and showed she had already thought through the operational implications. He answered them directly. She did not perform gratitude. He appreciated that more than he knew how to say. When he was putting on his coat to leave, she said, "Can I ask you something?" He turned. "That night." She held his gaze. "I saw you from the desk. You were sitting outside for a long time, in the rain." She paused. "I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I'd make it worse." He thought about the 7 words, about the folded paper in his wallet. "You made it better," he said. "You made it possible." She nodded slowly, and he thought she was going to say something else, but she didn't, and somehow that was right. He drove back in the late afternoon, the sun low and direct through the windshield, the miles unreeling in the quiet. He thought about Judith's handshake, about the children's books in the corner, about the sign on the door, "You belong here," and wondered if Waverly had written it for her patients or for herself, or if, by now, there was any difference. He thought, some people show you the shape of your own life by the way they live theirs. He thought, if she ever has room, come back. Not as the man who had been saved, though that was true. Not as the man with the grant check, though that too was real. But as someone who had learned, across 2 years and more loss than he could quantify, that the only honest way to carry guilt was to make something of it, and that the only honest way to receive a gift, even one given by a stranger in the dark, even one delivered in 7 words through a crack under a door, was to spend a long time becoming someone worth giving it to. He did not call her the next day. He did not reach out for weeks. When he finally did, it was in the form of a brief message through the Foundation's official channel, asking whether the program had considered expansion into the neighboring county and whether she'd be open to a call to discuss it. She replied within an hour, yes, and yes. They spoke professionally for 40 minutes. At the end, she said, "You know you can just text me, right?" And he laughed, real, unexpected, the kind that startled him, for the first time in longer than he could remember. He saved her number under her name. No title, no designation, just Waverly Dunn. That night he stood at the window of his apartment and looked out at the city that had, a year ago, felt like someone else's city, someone else's life. The lights were the same. The distance was the same. But somewhere in the 3 hours between here and a church with oak trees out front, something had completed a circuit that he hadn't known was open. He took the folded note from his wallet. Read it once more, though he no longer needed to. "Whatever you're carrying tonight, you matter." He refolded it carefully, put it back. "Some things you carry not because they're heavy, but because they remind you what it felt like to be found." I keep thinking about what Waverly didn't do that night. She didn't call the manager. She didn't knock on the door. She didn't introduce herself or ask for anything in return. She just paid attention to a stranger sitting alone in the rain, and then she acted on what she saw. That's the part I can't stop coming back to. Not the grand gesture, the small, private one that no one would have noticed if she'd chosen to look away. There's something I've come to believe, not from reading it somewhere but from watching what actually happens in real lives, the way we treat moments of moral choice, The ones where we could easily do nothing is what slowly builds or slowly erodes the kind of person we become. Waverly could have stayed behind that desk and told herself it wasn't her business. Most people would have. She didn't, and I don't think that was an accident of personality. I think it was a habit of conscience, built quietly over years of choosing to notice. And Colton. What he did after that night matters just as much to me. He didn't use the investigation's findings to wash his hands of Roy Callahan's death. He could have. The legal exposure was gone. The board would have let him frame it as exoneration. Instead, he drove to Baton Rouge himself. He sat in that kitchen. He said the name out loud until it stopped tasting like acid. That's not a thing most people have the honesty to do. That takes a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with confidence. It's the courage to stay accountable when you no longer have to be. I think about the 2 years Waverly spent building that program in a church basement. No funding, no guarantee it would amount to anything, just a folding table and the conviction that people who couldn't navigate the healthcare system deserved someone in their corner. That's the kind of long, unglamorous effort that doesn't get photographed. It happens in the early mornings and the late nights, when no one is watching and there's no external pressure keeping you going except your own sense of what matters. That's what real persistence looks like to me. Not dramatic, not loud, just relentlessly showing up for the thing you believe in. What strikes me about Colton's and Waverly's story is that neither of them did anything impossible. She wrote 7 words on a piece of paper. He drove to Baton Rouge. She enrolled in a program and rented 2 rooms. He asked questions until he found the truth. Every single step was within ordinary human reach. The reason the story lands the way it does, the reason I find myself returning to it, is that both of them made a choice, repeatedly, to do the harder right thing when the easier wrong thing was available. That accumulation of choices is what I'd call character. And character, I've come to understand, is not something you have or don't have. It's something you practice, decision by decision, in rooms where no one is keeping score. The note in Colton's wallet, worn soft at the corners from 2 years of handling, isn't just a keepsake. It's proof that one person's integrity can reach someone they've never met at the exact moment it's needed most. I think we underestimate how often we're that person for someone else without ever knowing it.